I think aliens have considered visiting planet Earth, but then they see people fighting over stuff like the new Barista Cup, and then they probably backtrack and decide to not show themselves. On a side note, you actually can buy a Barista Cup from like eBay, but you'll be paying about $300. You could always try selling like one of your kidneys, but then again, you're probably an alcoholic who wants your tiny little shriveled up kidneys. But anyways, all buffoonery aside, let's get straight into today's video. And this is actually a pretty serious topic. We're actually counting down the top 10 best animated DC films of all time. If your list is different than mine, or if you disagree with it, just know that you will live the rest of your life being wrong, because this is 100% the most accurate list of all time. I'm obviously totally joking, and there is no such thing as a 100% top 10 list ever, because at the end of the day, I think it's a matter of personal perspective, personal opinion, and personal taste. And so that's definitely going to factor into today's video. But regardless, I'm still curious to see what you guys have to say. So let me know your top 10 down below. Which one do you disagree with, agree with? I'm kind of curious to see what the community has to say. So without further ado, without wasting any more of your precious time and my useless saliva, let's get straight into number 10, where we have Batman Assault on Arkham Asylum. I absolutely love this animated film. If you guys haven't been able to check it out, I highly suggest you guys do so. It's essentially like two different storylines playing out simultaneously on screen. We have Batman, who's trying to stop the Joker, and then we have the Suicide Squad trying to retrieve some information that has been stolen by the Riddler. We have potentially the greatest voice actor of all time, Kevin Conroy, playing Batman. We have Matthew Gray as the Riddler, Troy Baker as the Joker, and then potentially my favorite voice actor of all time, John DiMaggio as King Shark. He will, for me at least, always be Marcus from Gears of War. I was a huge fan of the Gears of War franchise, and I was pleasantly surprised to see him in a lot of animated projects. He's definitely a voice actor that is going to pop up a lot on today's video. But as I mentioned, it's one of the best animated films out there. It's very cohesive, very witty, and overall it's a very enjoyable story, and it's one of the few animated DC films that actually legitimately feels like a comic book. Like, I could easily see this being almost a copy and paste type of situation. If you haven't watched a lot of DC animated films, I think this is a perfect jumping on point. It's not too deep, it's not too elaborate, it's not too emotionally drenching. It's just a good, solid animated film with some really good twists and turns and some really great action sequences. Moving on to the ninth spot, we have Wonder Woman from 2009, and the cast for this particular animated film is absolutely star-studded. You have Kerry Russell as Wonder Woman. A lot of people may know her from The Americans or from her brief appearance in the Star Wars franchise. Nathan Fillion as Steve Trevor, and that's also a name that is going to jump around quite a bit on today's list. You have Alfred Molina as Ares. And yes, in case you guys are wondering, that's Alfred Molina from Spider-Man 2. Rosario Dawson as Artemis, and John DiMaggio was also a voice actor in this film. And I have to say, Wonder Woman, for the longest time, I think before her two live-action projects, was always kind of disrespected, especially in the comic book community. She didn't always get the respect that she deserved, and it's just really nice to see a really good, cohesive animated film based on the Wonder Woman storyline. Now, clearly times have changed. We did get the two live action films. We've actually gotten some really good storylines featuring Wonder Woman, and so I hope that in the foreseeable future this is a consistent trend, because Wonder Woman definitely deserves a spotlight. She is a phenomenal character in the DC universe. And this is another one of those films in the animated universe that I think is a good jumping on point. Like, this is if this is your first animated film, I think you'll kind of get a really good grasp for the technique or the stylings that they use for a lot of the animated films. And as I mentioned, the fact that they were able to get Kerry Russell as Wonder Woman here, I think it just demonstrates how much love and effort was poured into this project, and you can definitely see that come through in the film. Moving on to the 8th spot on today's video, we have Batman Year One from 2011, and this was right around the time when DC Comics was really, or I should say Warner Bros. Was really trying to push more PG-13, or I should say they were pushing that PG-13 rating for a lot of their animated films. I think originally they did that, they went away from it, and I think this was kind of one of those films that brought it back a little bit. It was very gritty, it was violent, it was hyper realistic, it was just kind of was very down to earth, which is just not something that you see from Warner Bros, or you hadn't been seeing from Warner Bros prior to that time frame. It was just a very good, well put together animated film. It kind of explores the beginning, or I should say one of the beginning storylines involving Bruce Wayne and Jim Gordon. In this particular case, you actually have Jim Gordon voiced by Bryan Cranston. For those of you that are not too familiar with Bryan, he has had some absolutely stellar performances. Most people know him from Breaking Bad, but personally, I've been following him since his days as Hal, aka Malcolm in the Middle's father. It was probably one of the most iconic performances in that show, and I think as time went by, people started to really appreciate him as an actor. But if you're an OG, you know him from Malcolm in the Middle. From then, you could actually tell he had like legitimate acting chops, and then eventually people kind of really gravitated towards him, and he got like his big breakthrough role in Breaking Bad. But he did an absolutely stellar job there. You also have Ben McKenzie voicing Batman, which is really interesting because Ben McKenzie would actually end up playing Jim Gordon on the Gotham live action show, which is kind of interesting the way that things worked out. He started off voicing Batman and eventually moved on to the role of Jim Gordon. If you guys are not too familiar with Gotham, it's kind of like a prequel to the DC universe. Batman is actually this tiny little orphan, and Jim Gordon is a detective kind of roaming Gotham City and solving crimes. But anyways, if you guys want, as I mentioned, just kind of a gritty, very realistic take on Batman and kind of his beginnings in animated form, I think this is just an absolutely phenomenal animated film that I think all Batman fans should definitely check out. Moving on to the 7th spot on today's list, we have Dark Knight Returns Part 1, an absolute brilliant masterpiece. This is essentially telling a story where Batman, or I should say Bruce Wayne, comes out of retirement and actually takes up the Batman cowl again, and it just ruffles a lot of feathers. A lot of the people that are in power really don't like it, and it plays very well into Dark Knight Returns Part 2, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This was a star-studded cast as well. You have Peter Weller as Batman, Michael Emerson as the Joker, and if you guys are not familiar with Emerson in some of his previous work, just take a look at Lost, which honestly is one of my favorite shows ever on ABC. Absolutely brilliant. J.J. Abrams was at the helm, and that's really where he got his big breakthrough opportunity. But in that particular show, he plays a very intriguing character that honestly I think ends up becoming a fan favorite, at least through the stretch that he is featured on the show. And it's funny because usually we talk so much about like the greats in terms of either voice actors or live action actors that have portrayed Joker, whether that's Mark Hamill, Heath Ledger, you have Jared Leto, and then the list just goes on and on. Let's not forget Jack Nicholson, but I honestly feel like Emerson is always overlooked, but he did an absolutely phenomenal job of bringing Joker to life and kind of giving him his own personality and setting him apart from all of the other Jokers that we had seen up to this point. You also have Mark Valley voicing Superman, and you even have some cameo appearances from Conan O'Brien himself. He actually voices a couple of characters in this film. Tara Strong also voiced a couple of different characters in this film. If you guys are not familiar with Tara Strong, she actually does voice quite a few different characters within the animated DC universe, and she will be mentioned at least more than once in today's video. We'll get into that a little bit later, but yes, this is an absolutely phenomenal film. There are those out there that feel like both Dark Knight Returns Part 1 and 2 should be considered one film, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give each of these films their own spotlight, give them their own opportunity to shine, and this is definitely a very deserving film of a top 10 spot. Next up, this wouldn't be a proper DC animated film if I didn't include Justice League Doom. You have the great Tim Daly as Superman, you have Kevin Conroy as Batman, you have Michael Rosenbaum as the Flash, and if you guys are not familiar with who Rosenbaum is, if you guys watched or grew up watching Smallville, You'll be familiar with him. He's Lex Luthor. He actually has a really good podcast. If you guys haven't checked it out, I highly suggest you guys do so. He does a great job of just breaking down DC content in general. And then they had Nathan Fillion as a Green Lantern, which is interesting. For those of you guys that are not too familiar with who Nathan Fillion is, well, he actually played the live action Green Lantern in the newest live action Superman. He did an absolutely phenomenal job as Guy Gardner, and I honestly really like the fact that they, kind of rewarded him for being a part of the DC animated universe for so long, and they finally kind of gave him a really big role, a really big opportunity in potentially like the biggest DC project in over a decade. Now, the narrative, the dialogue, the film itself isn't necessarily like the best in terms of DC animation, but I actually really like the concept. I like the bare bones of it. It's essentially a scenario where Batman has all of his files stolen, and essentially all of the secrets or all of the weaknesses of each individual superhero on the Justice League is in those files. So theoretically, with these files, you could essentially stop each individual superhero just based on these Batman files. And I thought that was just kind of really intriguing. It's weird and kind of obscure to see a storyline like that, but it's nice because it kind of reminds you exactly of why Batman is such an iconic character in the DC universe without really having superpowers. It has a lot to do with how well prepared he is and how he's usually like a few steps ahead of everybody, even though he isn't like this big giant super powered being. But it just kind of reminds us of how important he has been to the Justice League universe as a whole. Next up, we have Flashpoint Paradox from 2013. What's crazy is that the original live action Flash film took a lot of inspiration from this particular comic book storyline. You have Justin Chambers as the Flash. You even have Michael B. Jordan as the Cyborg. You heard that correctly. Yes, that gigantic megastar was actually voicing Cyborg way back in the day, which is mind-blowing. I personally do not recall ever knowing this information. So going back and looking through the cast, I was just really surprised by that. We would have Nathan Fillion reprising his role as a Green Lantern. And then Ron Perlman would actually voice Deathstroke. If you guys are not familiar with Ron, he was actually Hellboy in the live-action Hellboy from Guillermo del Toro. Kevin Conroy would reprise his role as Batman, and then Dana Delaney would voice Lois Lane. This is an iconic storyline. Flash goes back, tries to change a few things in his past, and then essentially creates like an alternate universe, an alternate dimension. And this film is kind of him trying to right his wrongs. It's a really interesting storyline. It's very dark, very gritty, and I'm surprised that they would make this into a DC animated film. It's not something that you usually see, but as I continue saying, it's always worth giving Warner Bros. Credit because they're willing to take risks on a lot of these projects. They're not storylines that are very well known, and if they are very well known, you definitely wouldn't expect them in animated form. So it's just kind of a nice little breath of fresh air. This could have easily been much higher, considering it is potentially one of the greatest DC storylines of all time. But I think the next spots are definitely going to showcase not only some of the best storylines, but also some of the best casts ever featured in the DC animated universe. Next up, we have Under the Red Hood from 2010, and this honestly has one of the most intriguing storylines. I'm not really going to give it away, although if you've read comic books or if you're familiar with just the DC universe, you'll know exactly where I'm going with this. But it's essentially kind of like a modern introduction of Red Hood into the DC animated universe, but it's the way that they presented that is very interesting, because at the end, I suppose it's kind of a really negative take on like Bruce Wayne / Batman's philosophy about not ending people. Like his moral compass has always been something that he's looked up to, and in this particular film it kind of throws that on its head, because there is a character that he should have looked after, and unfortunately he failed that particular character, and the transformation I think we get to see on screen is absolutely phenomenal. I love this film. It's one of the best animated films out there. It's incredibly dark. It's very emotional, very meaningful. And this is really much about the Bat family, which, you know, in previous entries or in a lot of the entries here, it's kind of either the extended Batman family or it's just Justice League in general. Here, they really dive into the relationships that Batman has with all of his students, basically. And I just really like that. I like the dynamic. I like the back and forth. The dialogue is absolutely superb as well. If you guys have ever played the video game Batman Arkham Knight, this is essentially like that video game, but in an animated film. And like I said, it's absolutely brilliant. You have Bruce Greenwood voicing Batman, Jensen Ackles as Red Hood. And if you guys are not familiar with him, he has been playing a lot of big live action characters. He's on The Boys as well as Supernatural. Neil Patrick Harris actually plays Nightwing. A lot of people are familiar with Harris from How I Met Your Mother, and he has actually had quite a few voicing gigs in the past. And then we have Wade Williams playing Black Mask. He's another really good actor that has had some pretty good roles in the past. He was actually a really big character on the show Prison Break. But honestly, we're getting into that territory where any of like the top 4 films could easily be number 1, but I had to choose one, and ultimately this one fell a little bit, but I could definitely see why a lot of people would actually have this film as number 1 on their personal list. At our third spot, we have Death of Superman from 2018. And I'm putting this in my top 3, knowing full well that very few people are actually going to have this in their top 3. But honestly, that cast is absolutely star-studded. It's a brilliant combination. I think on paper they don't make a lot of sense, but then when you actually hear the voice acting, it just adds another layer to the film. You have Jerry O'Connell as Superman, Rainn Wilson, aka Dwight Schrute, as Lex Luthor. Rosario Dawson would actually reprise her role as Wonder Woman, and then Nathan Fillion, if you can guess who he was on the movie. Yes, he was Green Lantern again. And I completely get why people would be a little bit frustrated with this particular animated film, because it's kind of a retelling of a story that people are kind of fatigued about. It's Doomsday arriving on planet Earth, the entire Justice League going at him, and then Superman eventually taking him down with him. It's a phenomenal story, but unfortunately it's been retold a number of different times. We've seen it in some of the CW shows, we've seen it in comic book retold a number of different times. We saw it on Batman vs Superman Dawn of Justice as well. So the fatigue is there, but this is definitely one of the best animated films out there. The action is top notch, and we rarely get to see just how much of an imposing force Doomsday is, and we definitely get a really good insight into that. I'm actually genuinely excited to see if James Gunn decides to actually bring Doomsday into his live action universe, because I think even though he is a massively overused villain, I would actually really enjoy him like retelling the entire story and giving us his own twist on an epic battle between Doomsday and Superman. And then at our second spot, we're gonna have Dark Knight Returns Part 2 from 2013. We have Peter Weller voicing Batman. We have Michael Emerson as Joker yet again, Wade Williams as Harvey Dent, and the great Mark Valley as Superman. And yes, the voice acting here is superb, but that's not exactly why I actually put this film up here. I just absolutely love this story overall. It's about Batman coming out of retirement. It's about Superman essentially becoming a puppet of the government, and it's one of the most epic clashes of all time. A lot of the newer Snyderverse films actually took a ton of inspiration from this particular storyline, and it's easy to see why. I will say it's also very intriguing to see like an older Bruce Wayne. It's not something that we usually see in comic book form. For the longest time, it felt like the DC universe or the DC comic book universe was essentially just retelling the Bruce Wayne origin story over and over again, not only in comic book form, but also in live action form. It feels like everybody can just recite it with their eyes closed. We know that, Bruce Wayne loses his family early on, and we know about his upbringing upbringing, but it was just nice to see some of his story being retold from a completely different perspective. You know, him coming out of retirement as an older individual, and it was just kind of like a breath of fresh air. And it was still interesting to see how Bruce Wayne was still not waning on his personal moral beliefs and how he was unwilling to betray them, even though that meant that he essentially had to put his body on the line way more consistently than before, just because the stakes were higher, just because of his age and just how much his body had taken over the years. And then finally, we arrived at the top spot, and let me just say, it was an absolute trip going through each and every single one of these animated films. You kind of get taken back to that particular moment when you first watched it. And I have to say, Mask of the Phantasm just holds a very close and dear spot in my heart, because it is one of the best DC animated films of all time, but it's also one that I continuously watch growing up. I guess that may explain why I am the way that I am. But this originally came out in 1993. It featured the great and the late Kevin Conroy as Batman and Dana Delaney as Andrea. It's very dark. It's essentially what you would expect from the DC universe, but to bring it into animated form, it was a huge risk, especially considering all of the comic book based animated films that were either after it or before it were usually very light-hearted. It was very rare to see very dark and gritty and realistic things brought to audiences in animated form, but they went all out here. It was a very emotional film. It was a very touching film, and it's one of those very few films that actually showcase Batman in a very vulnerable state, right? He's in love. He's going through this kind of romantic phase with Andrea, and I really like that. It's just not something that you usually see consistently from animated films or just DC films in general. And it's yet another one of those films where, like, Batman's moral compass is really pushed to the limits. It's really challenged, and he has to be able to make really tough choices. Very similar to some of the previous entries on today's list. They deal with a lot of real life situations that aren't always black and white. There's a lot of gray in this world, and I think that's what a lot of these animated films present extremely well. But anyways, that is all I have for you guys. I apologize if this list ran way too long. I really wanted to bring this together for you guys. I'll be honest, this took a ton of effort, a ton of time. I do have my regular channel where I upload pretty consistently, but this is a channel that I've kind of abandoned. But even then, it's very difficult to balance both and to keep both with like a ton of content. So I hope that you guys enjoyed it, or at least took something away from it. At least if you're somebody that hasn't watched a lot of DC animated films, at least I can give you a few good options to kind of sit down and ponder and potentially watch in the foreseeable future. But as I said at the beginning of the video, this is a completely personal list. Let me know if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, or just let me know what your top 10 list is down below. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure to stay tuned. We do plan on uploading way more consistently onto this channel. And let me know what ideas you guys would like to see later down the line. What other top 10s would you guys like to see related to comic books in general, or just anything in general? Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Stay safe out there, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.